Middle English refers to the varieties of the English language spoken after the Norman Conquest until the late 15th century. Scholarly opinion varies, but the Oxford English Dictionary specifies the period of 1150 to 1500. This stage of the development of the English language roughly followed the height of the Late Middle Ages. Middle English developed out of Late Old English, seeing many dramatic changes in its grammar, pronunciation and orthography. Writing customs during Middle English times varied widely, but by the end of the period, about 1470, aided by the invention of the printing press, a standard based on the London dialect had become established. This largely forms the basis for modern English spelling, although pronunciation has changed considerably since that time. Middle English was succeeded in England by the era of early modern English, which lasted until about 1650. By that time, a variant of the Northumbrian dialect was developing into the Scots language. During the Middle English period, many Old English grammatical features were simplified or disappeared. This includes the reduction of most grammatical cases, and the simplification of noun, adjective and verb inflection. Middle English also saw a mass adoption of Norman French vocabulary, especially in areas such as politics, law, the arts, religion and other courtly language. Everyday English vocabulary remained mostly Germanic, with Old Norse influence becoming apparent. Significant changes in pronunciation took place, especially in the case of long vowels and diphthongs, which in the later Middle English period began to undergo the Great Vowel Shift. Little survives of early Middle English literature, most likely due to the Norman domination and the prestige that came with writing in French rather than English. During the 14th century, a new style of literature emerged, with the works of notable writers such as John Wycliffe and Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales remains the most studied and read work of the period. Poets wrote both in the vernacular and courtly English. It is popularly believed that William Shakespeare wrote in Middle English, but he actually wrote in early modern English. History. Transition from Old English. The latter part of the 11th century was a period of transition from late Old English to early Middle English. The influence of Old Norse certainly helped move English from a synthetic language towards a more analytic or isolating word order, a deep change at the grammatical level. The eagerness of Vikings in the Danelaw to communicate with the southern Anglo-Saxon neighbors produced a friction that led to the erosion of the complicated inflectional word endings. Old Norse likely had a greater impact on this deep change to Middle and Modern English than any other language. Simeon Potter notes, no less far-reaching was the influence of Scandinavian upon the inflectional endings of English in hastening that wearing away and leveling of grammatical forms which gradually spread from north to south. It was, after all, of salutary influence. The gain was greater than the loss. There was a gain in directness, in clarity, and in strength. The strength of the Viking influence on Old English appears from the fact that the indispensable elements of the language, pronouns, modals, comparatives, pronominal adverbs, conjunctions and prepositions, show the most marked Danish influence. The best evidence of Scandinavian influence appears in the extensive word borrowings for, as Jespersen indicates, no texts exist in either Scandinavia or in northern England from this time to give certain evidence of an influence on syntax. The change to Old English from Old Norse was substantive, pervasive, and of a democratic character. Like close cousins, Old Norse and Old English resembled each other, and with some words in common, they roughly understood each other. In time the inflections melted away and the analytic pattern emerged. It is most important to recognize that in many words the English and Scandinavian language differed chiefly in their inflectional elements. The body of the word was so nearly the same in the two languages that only the endings would put obstacles in the way of mutual understanding. In the mixed population which existed in the Danelaw, these endings must have led to much confusion, tending gradually to become obscured and finally lost. Quote, "This blending of peoples and languages happily resulted in simplifying English grammar, while the influence of Scandinavian language was strongest in dialects in the Danelaw region and Scotland. The spoken words crept into the language in the 10th and 11th centuries near the transition from the Old to Middle English period, but such borrowed words only appeared in the Middle English writing at the beginning of the 13th century, likely because of a scarcity of literary texts from an earlier date. Towards the end of the Old English period, perhaps the single most significant stimulus to the evolution of the English language occurred with the Norman Conquest of 1066. The resulting flood of French words blended with the existing Germanic stream to create a more supple and expressive language. It gave English an appetite for acquiring new words from any language, and perpetuated the loss of inflectional endings. The simplification of grammar initiated by the earlier influence of Scandinavian in the Danelaw. The Normans too were Scandinavians, so the Norse, using old stones and new, built the sure foundation and strong walls of Fortress English, the primary architects of change. The adaptability of the Scandinavians, always a marked characteristic of these people, nowhere showed itself more able than in Normandy. In France, the original Norsemen quickly adopted the ideas, language, religion and customs of the more sophisticated local culture, adding French tactics to their impetuous courage and building those great Norman cathedrals, the first to seize upon this newly fashioned fortress and to begin to build the sturdy walls higher was the undisputed genius of Middle English, Geoffrey Chaucer. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 saw the replacement of the top levels of the English-speaking political and ecclesiastical hierarchies by Norman rulers who spoke an Old French dialect called Old Norman, which in England developed into a variety called Anglo-Norman. Norman thus came into use as a language of polite discourse and literature, and this fundamentally altered the role of Old English in education and administration. Even though many Normans of the early period were illiterate and depended on the clergy for written communication and record-keeping, large numbers of words of French origin started to be borrowed into the English language, often existing alongside native English words of similar meaning, giving rise to such modern English pairs as pig, pork, chicken, poultry, calf, veal, cow, beef, sheep, mutton, wood, forest, house, mansion, worthy, valuable, bold, courageous, freedom, liberty. The role of Anglo-Norman as the language of government and law can be seen in the abundance of modern English words for the mechanisms of government that derive from Anglo-Norman: court, judge, jury, appeal, parliament. There are also many Norman-derived terms relating to the chivalric cultures that arose in the 12th century, an era of feudalism and crusading. Sometimes, and particularly later, words were taken from Latin, giving such sets as kingly, royal, regal. Later French borrowings came from Standard rather than Norman French. This leads to such cognate pairs as warden, guardian. The end of Anglo-Saxon rule did not, of course, change the language immediately. The general population would have spoken the same dialects as before the conquest. These changed slowly until written records of them became available for study, which varies in different regions. Once the writing of Old English came to an end, Middle English had no standard language, only dialects that derived from the dialects of the same regions in the Anglo-Saxon period. Early Middle English. Early Middle English has a largely Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, but a greatly simplified inflectional system. The grammatical relations that were expressed in Old English by the dative and instrumental cases are replaced in Early Middle English with Prepositional constructions. The Old English genitive s survives in the s of the modern English possessive, but most of the other case endings disappeared in the early Middle English period, including most of the roughly 12 forms of the definite article. The dual personal pronouns also disappeared from English during this period. Gradually, the wealthy and the government anglicized again, although Norman remained the dominant language of literature and law until the 14th century, even after the loss of the majority of the continental possessions of the English monarchy. The loss of case endings was part of a general trend from inflections to fixed word order that also occurred in other Germanic languages, and therefore cannot be attributed simply to the influence of French-speaking sections of the population. English did, after all, remain the vernacular. It is also argued that Norse immigrants to England had a great impact on the loss of inflectional endings in Middle English. One argument is that, although Norse and English speakers were somewhat comprehensible to each other, the Norse speakers' inability to reproduce the ending sounds of English words influenced Middle English's loss of inflectional endings. Another argument is that the morphological simplifications were caused by Romano Britons who were bilingual in Old English and either Brittonic languages or British Latin. Some scholars even describe Middle English as a Creole, coming about through extensive contact between English and either Norse, Norman, Celtic or Latin speakers. Important texts for the reconstruction of the evolution of Middle English out of Old English are the Peterborough Chronicle, which continued to be compiled up to 1154, the Ormulum, a biblical commentary probably composed in Lincolnshire in the second half of the 12th century, incorporating a unique phonetic spelling system, and the Anne Wis and the Catherine Group, religious texts written for anchoresses, apparently in the West Midlands in the early 13th century. The language found in the last two works is sometimes called the Ab language. 14th century. From around the early 14th century there was significant migration into London, particularly from the counties of the East Midlands, and a new prestige London dialect began to develop, based chiefly on the speech of the East Midlands, but also influenced by that of other regions. The writing of this period, however, continues to reflect a variety of regional forms of English. The Ironbite of Inwit, a translation of a French confessional prose work, completed in 1340, is written in a Kentish dialect. The best-known writer of Middle English, Geoffrey Chaucer, wrote in the second half of the 14th century in the emerging London dialect, although he also portrays some of his characters as speaking in northern dialects, as in the Reeve's Tale. In the English-speaking areas of lowland Scotland, an independent standard was developing, based on the Northumbrian dialect. This would develop into what came to be known as the Scots language. Late Middle English. Official documents which since the Norman Conquest had generally been written in French, began to appear in English from about 1430. From here on the Chancery standard of written English begins to emerge, based, like Chaucer's work, on the East Midlands influenced London speech. The clerks who used this standard would have been familiar with French and Latin, which probably influenced the forms they chose. By the mid-15th century, Chancery standard was used for most official purposes except by the Church, which still used Latin, and for some legal purposes, for which law French and some Latin were used. It was disseminated around England by bureaucrats on official business and slowly gained prestige. Chancery standard was not the only influence on later forms of English. Its level of influence is disputed, and of course a variety of spoken dialects continued to exist, but it provided a core around which early modern English could crystallize. Towards the end of the 15th century, a more modern English began to emerge. Printing began in England with the introduction of the printing press by William Caxton in the 1470s, and this helped stabilize the language. In the late 1490s and early 1500s, printer Richard Pinson favored Chancery standard in his published works, and consequently pushed the English spelling further towards standardization. A wider public became familiar with a uniform language with a standardized, printed English Bible and prayer book being read to church congregations from the 1540s onward, and the era of modern English began. The end of the Middle English period is taken to occur at some point around the end of the 15th century, possibly with the introduction of printing in the 1470s, or the start of the Tudor period in 1485. The next phase in the development of the language is that of early modern English, which lasted until about 1650. Phonology. The main changes between the Old English sound system and that of Middle English include emergence of the voiced fricatives v, th, z as separate phonemes, rather than mere allophones of the corresponding voiceless fricatives, reduction of the Old English diphthongs to monophthongs, and the emergence of new diphthongs due to vowel breaking in certain positions, change of Old English post-vocalic j with two off-glides, and borrowing from French. Merging of Old English a and into a single vowel a, raising of the long vowel a to and raising and rounding of to, unrounding of the front rounded vowels in most dialects, lengthening of vowels in open syllables. The resultant long vowels subsequently underwent changes of quality in the Great Vowel Shift, which began during the later Middle English period. Loss of gemination. Loss of weak final vowels. By Chaucer's time this vowel was silent in normal speech, although it could optionally be pronounced in verse as the meter required. Also, non-final unstressed e was dropped when adjacent to only a single consonant on either side if there was another short e in an adjoining syllable. Thus, every began to be pronounced as every and Palmer's as Palmer's. The combination of the last three processes listed above led to the spelling conventions associated with silent e and doubled consonants. Morphology. Nouns. Middle English retains only two distinct noun ending patterns from the more complex system of inflection in Old English. The early Middle English nouns Engle and name demonstrate the two patterns. Some nouns of the Engle type have an e in the nominative, accusative singular, like the weak declension, but otherwise strong endings. Often these are the same nouns that had an e in the nominative, accusative singular of Old English. The distinct dative case was lost in early Middle English. The genitive survived, however, but by the end of the Middle English period, only the strong s ending was in use. The strong s plural form has survived into modern English. The weak n form is now rare and used only in oxen and, as part of a double plural, in children and brethren. Some dialects still have forms such as ein, schoen, hosen, kine, and been. Pronouns. Middle English personal pronouns were mostly developed from those of Old English, with the exception of the third-person plural, a borrowing from Old Norse. Also, the nominative form of the feminine third-person singular was replaced by a form of the demonstrative that developed into sche, but the alternative he remained in some areas for a long time. As with nouns, there was some inflectional simplification, but pronouns, unlike nouns, retained distinct nominative and accusative forms. Third-person pronouns also retained a distinction between accusative and dative forms, but that was gradually lost. The masculine hein was replaced by him south of the Thames by the early 14th century, and the neuter dative him was ousted by it in most dialects by the 15. The following table shows some of the various Middle English pronouns, together with the modern and Old English equivalents. Many other variations are noted in Middle English sources because of differences in spellings and pronunciations at different times and in different dialects. Verbs. As a general rule, the indicative first-person singular of verbs in the present tense ends in e, the second person in street, and the third person in e, is pronounced like the unvoiced th in think, but, under certain circumstances, it may be like the voiced th in that. The following table illustrates the conjugation pattern of but one dialect. Plural forms vary strongly by dialect, with Southern dialects preserving the Old English e, Midland dialects showing n from about 1200 and Northern forms using s in the third person singular as well as the plural. The past tense of weak verbs is formed by adding an ed at t ending. The past tense forms, without the personal endings, also serve as past participles with past participle prefixes derived from Old English, I, y and sometimes by. Strong verbs, by contrast, form the past tense by changing the stem vowel, as in modern English. Orthography. With the discontinuation of the late West Saxon standard used for the writing of Old English in the period prior to the Norman Conquest, Middle English came to be written in a wide variety of scribal forms, reflecting different regional dialects and orthographic conventions. Later in the Middle English period, however, and particularly with the development of the Chancery standard in the 15th century, orthography became relatively standardized in a form based on the East Midlands influenced speech of London. Spelling at the time was mostly quite regular. The irregularity of present-day English orthography is largely due to pronunciation changes that have taken place over the early modern English and modern English eras. Middle English generally did not have silent letters. For example, night was pronounced. The major exception was the silent e originally pronounced, but lost in normal speech by Chaucer's time. This letter, however, came to indicate a lengthened, and later also modified, pronunciation of a preceding vowel. For example, in name, originally pronounced as two syllables, the a in the first syllable lengthened. The final weak vowel was later dropped, and the remaining long vowel was modified in the great vowel shift. The final e, now silent, thus became the indicator of the longer and changed pronunciation of a. In fact, vowels could have this lengthened and modified pronunciation in various positions, particularly before a single consonant letter and another vowel, or before certain pairs of consonants. A related convention involved the doubling of consonant letters to show that the preceding vowel was not to be lengthened. In some cases, the double consonant represented a sound that was geminated, i.e. had genuinely been doubled. In other cases, by analogy, the consonant was written double merely to indicate the lack of lengthening. Alphabet. The basic Old English Latin alphabet had consisted of 20 standard letters plus 4 additional letters. Ash, a, th, thorn, th, and win, w. Ash was no longer required in Middle English, as the Old English vowel a that it represented had merged into a. The symbol nonetheless came to be used as a ligature for the digraph a in many words of Greek or Latin origin, as did o for o. Eth and thorn both represented theta in Old English. Eth fell out of use during the 13th century and was replaced by thorn. Thorn mostly fell out of use during the 14th century and was replaced by th, has led to the modern mispronunciation of thorn as y in this context. See Old e. Win, which represented the phoneme with, was replaced by w during the 13th century, due to its similarity to the letter p. It is mostly represented by W in modern editions of Old and Middle English texts, even when the manuscript has Win. Under Norman influence, the continental Carolingian script replaced the insular that had been used for Old English. However, because of the significant difference in appearance between the Old Insular G and the Carolingian G, the former continued in use as a separate letter, known as yog, written. This was adopted for use to represent a variety of sounds, while the Carolingian G was normally used for. Instances of yog were eventually replaced by J or Y, and by GH in words like night and la. In Middle Scots, yog became indistinguishable from cursive Z, and printers tended to use Z when yog was not available in the fonts. This led to new spellings, as in Mackenzie, where the Z replaced a yog which had the pronunciation J. Under continental influence, the letters K, Q and Z, which had not normally been used by Old English scribes, came to be commonly used in the writing of Middle English. Also, the newer Latin letter W was introduced. The distinct letter forms V and U came into use, but were still used interchangeably. The same applies to J and I. The consonantal J, I was sometimes used to transliterate the Hebrew letter Yud, representing the palatal approximant sound J. Words like Jerusalem, Joseph, etc., would have originally followed the Latin pronunciation beginning with J, that is, the sound of Y in yes, in some words. However, notably from Old French, J, I was used for the affricate D, as in schwa, used in Wycliffe's Bible. This was similar to the geminate sound which had been represented as CG in Old English. By the time of modern English, the sound came to be written as J, I at the start of words, and usually as DG elsewhere. It could also be written, mainly in French loanwords, as G, with the adoption of the soft G convention. Other symbols, many scribal abbreviations were also used. It was common for the Lollards to abbreviate the name of Jesus to IHC. The letters N and M were often omitted and indicated by a macron above an adjacent letter. So, for example, N could be written as I. A thorn with a superscript T or E could be used for that, and the thorn here resembled a Y, giving rise to the yo of ye olde. Various forms of the ampersand replaced the word and. Numbers were still always written using Roman numerals, except for some rare occurrences of Arabic numerals during the 15th century. Letter-to-sound correspondences. Although Middle English spelling was never fully standardized, the following table shows the pronunciations most usually represented by particular letters and digraphs towards the end of the Middle English period, using the notation given in the article on Middle English phonology. As explained above, single vowel letters had alternative pronunciations depending on whether they were in a position where the sounds had been subject to lengthening. Long vowel pronunciations were in flux due to the beginnings of the Great Vowel Shift.